I do see we have our guest speaker. And I'm going to turn it over to to Cameron.
Okay. I have the esteemed pleasure of introducing our distinguished guest today. We are very pleased to have the fortunate benefit of having Dr. Timothy Tyson with us today. Dr. Tyson is a senior research scholar at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University and an adjunct professor of American Studies at the University of North Carolina. His most recent book, The Blood of Emmett Till, won the 2018 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, made the long list of 10 books for the 2017 National Book Award, and was named Best Book of 2017 by both the Los Angeles Times and the National Public Radio. The Atlanta Constitutional Journal named it the Best Southern Book of 2017. Van R. Newkirk of The Atlantic writes that The Blood of Emmett Till manages to turn history into prophecy and demands that we do one vital thing we aren't often enough asked to do with history: learn from it. Tyson is also the author of Blood Done Sign My Name, which is a finalist, finalist for the National Book Circles Awards and a winner of the Southern Book Award for Nonfiction and the Grawemeyer Award in Religion. Tyson was executive producer of Mike Wiley's 2008 play and writer consultant for Jeb Stuart's 2010 feature film adaptation by that very title. His 1999 book, Radio Free Dixie, Robert F. Williams and the Roots of Black Power won the James Raleigh Prize for the Best Book on Race and the Frederick Jason Turner Prize for the first book in the U.S. history from the Organization of American Historians. It is also the basis for Negroes with Guns, Rob Williams and Black Power, which the OAH awarded the 2006 Eric Banu Prize for Best Historical Film. He is co-editor with David Selesky of Democracy Betrayed, the Wilmington Race Riots of 1898 and Its Legacy. He won the 1998 Outstanding Book Award from the Gustavus Meyer Center for Human Rights in North America and author of Ghosts of 1898, Wilmington's Race Riots and Rise of White Supremacy, which won a 2007 Excellence Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. He serves on the executive board of the North Carolina NAACP, Repairs of the Breach, and the UNC Center for Civil Rights. And since we are running a little behind, I'm just gonna make just a very quick, the reason why we wanted Dr. Tyson to speak is because he is one of the foremost theologians and historians on weaving together not only a theological basis of how it goes against what we think of ourselves as a Christian nation, and actually how history plays into that. Oftentimes, people view history view theology with an ahistorical lens. And Dr. Tyson so eloquently, especially from the perspective of a young white man growing up in the South, has been able to weave and narrate it so eloquently and so truthfully and so profoundly. So Dr. Tyson, we really appreciate you being with us today, and we're going to turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. And I'm so glad to be with Episcopalians United Against Racism today. I want to just commend you because the white church, I know that Episcopalians does not mean the white church, but that's a big chunk of it, and perhaps the most important part of the church to be awakened, to be put in action. I grew up, my father was a Methodist minister. His 5 brothers were all Methodist ministers, everybody in Eastern North Carolina. Their father, his father, his father, his father, going back to somewhere in the 1840s when we've lost the thread. And, you know, those that weren't preachers were bootleggers, but all in the spirit, I suppose. But when I grew up, you know, my uncles, my father and his brothers played spades, and they played, you know, for blood, not money. It was a very serious thing. And talked a lot of trash and talked a lot of politics, church politics in particular. And if you were very good and you were very quiet, you could sit in the corner and listen, which is always fascinating. And one thing that I came to understand at a very young age was that anti-racist clergy were prone to lose their pulpit, to get fired, to get run off, among other things. And that's how you got fired as a Methodist minister in the 60s and 70s. I came to see at a young age that violence was a big part of the social order. I'm not claiming to understand it, but a friend of mine's father committed a racial murder in public in Oxford, North Carolina, in 1970, little tobacco market town. There was an incident at a cash register at a Crossroads country store, and Henry Mara, a 23-year-old, just returned Vietnam veteran with 2 children and 1 on the way, said something that was confused for a flirtatious remark to the white woman at the cash register. And he was chased from the store and shot from behind with a shotgun in the buttocks, knocking him down, and then beaten to death with the stocks of the rifles. And then just shot between the eyes, the gun barrel on his head, really. And that I thought my friend's father and brothers were pretty sure to get convicted of murder and executed, which is what I understood the law to be. But they were acquitted by an all-white jury. The downtown area was burned in a series of arson attacks by, I later found local Black Vietnam veterans like Henry Mara, his compatriots, as a way of getting heard, as a way of trying to get justice. But anyway, the fire was 4 blocks from our house, and you could see it 20 miles away. So it burned on in my memory for a long time. And I went back finally and went to Robert Teal's barbershop. He was the murderer. And I did my first oral history interview. And the first words on that tape are, that N-word committed suicide, wanting to come in my store and 4-letter word my daughter-in-law, quote unquote. That is to say, Henry Mara had used unacceptable language in the presence of white womanhood. And that was in 1970. The book I wrote on Emmett Till, my most recent one, it's remarkable in some ways, the extent to which the plot is the same as far as what instigated it and the tensions underlying it. Because in the case of, in 1970, of Henry Mara's murder, and by the way, I would call it a lynching, actually, even though it happened sort of impromptu. A lynching is a murder by a group of people who are acting in service to tradition, race, what they perceive to be widely held values in the community, white supremacy, of course, in these cases that we're looking at. Now, this wasn't a planned announcement, and a lynching in many ways is an announcement from and about the configuration of social power. And that can also happen after the fact, because the powers that be in Oxford, the white ruling class, rallied around the murderers and supplied them with the best attorneys and plenty of legal defense. And the white public essentially accepted the verdict of not guilty and this is not a murder mystery. They accepted the verdict as a kind of protest verdict because it was May 1970. And in the fall of 1970, there was going to be, for the first time in Granville County, North Carolina, a unitary school system. That is to say, where there would be no black high school, there would be no white high school. All the students in Granville County, and Oxford, about 50% African American, 50% white, would be going to the same school. And of course, underneath that, there's this white supremacy and other things, but what W.B. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness. But there's also this race and sex complex that undergirds so much of history of the South. And then when I did the Till book, I found that Chicago was awash in the same stuff, same rhetoric around sexuality. Thereafter, now, that ultimately a change in the social hierarchy will mean interracial sexuality, interracial marriage, and there's also the invocation of the black beast rapist, which, by the way, is that image which still lives in the minds of Americans is a creation of the late 19th century, when in 9 of the 11 former states of the Confederacy, there were powerful interracial political movements in all but 2 states of the former Confederacy. Now that was not known. I was shocked. Actually, I was in most of the way through a PhD in American history before I ever heard such a thing. But those interracial political movements actually took state power in Tennessee and in Virginia with the Readjuster movement, and then in North Carolina with the Fusion movement in the late 19th century. And the black beast rapist was essentially trotted out to whip white Southerners, particularly poor white Southerners, into line and get them to act against their own best interest in white supremacy campaigns, in the overthrow of the governments in those states. So that plays a part too, because James Baldwin said, "We live in history, but history lives in us." And we just because you're ignorant of the past, just because you feel innocent of its horrors, does not actually save you from its consequences. And so, a historical understanding is vital for coming to grips with our racial realities now and in the future. All this takes place in history. History is not only what is behind us, but it's what is before us. And if we want to change that history in a meaningful way, we have to understand from whence we have come. And that's just a vital thing. Plus, an ahistorical approach to race is prima facie white supremacist, because if you don't take our contemporary situation in historical context, you can't begin to understand it, because there's a whole lot of Monday in every Tuesday, and we don't just unroll a blueprint every morning and decide, and discuss how do you think we should proceed as a society. That's not what happens. We pull and tug over what has gone before. We argue over it. Most political speeches are historical arguments in certain ways. Back when, we're going to make America great again. Back there was a time when it was like when things were much better and different. And then, but they came along. There's a they that has messed this up, and we must restore an idealized social order. And that's sort of standard white supremacist political rhetoric. I want to talk for a second. Well, first, I brought you two quotes from W.E.B. Du Bois, who's always on point, and these two speak to what we're doing today. He writes, "There was one thing that the white South feared more than Negro dishonesty, ignorance, and incompetency, and that was Negro honesty, knowledge, and efficiency." It's important to understand that the racial violence, white terror, was most often an attack on African-American accomplishment, achievement, building. That, the black beast rapist is invoked, but Ida B. Wells studied lynching very closely and well, and found that in less than 25% of the cases was there actually even an accusation about rape or sexualized racial violence, but that the far and away the most common impetus for lynching was economic competition, economic independence, displays of prosperity. My friend David Siselski lives in Harlow, North Carolina, about half the time, and he owns his grandmother's old house. But the next farm down the way belongs to the Goodettes, and the Goodettes made a lot of money in bootlegging during Prohibition. There's a brackish water creek that runs behind those farms, and you can take it out and to the Sound and then out to the ocean. And so the ships would come, and the whiskey would come from the Goodettes had a barn and a big setup, and they made CCC, Craven County Corn, which was a major brand of liquor, and the speakeasies all up and down the East Coast. So they made a lot of money, but from the outside, the house looked rather ramshackle because it was dangerous for people to know they had a piano. It was dangerous for people to know they had nice carpets on the floor. It was dangerous for them to focus on the education, to know much about the education of the Goodettes' children who went off to Princeton and such places. It was just and we see that in the Banks case, I believe. It's both a threat because it sets an example for other Black families. It's a threat because there's economic competition involved. There's a threat because it is read as an inherent critique of white people who have less. So a source of shame in that way. It's an affront to racial etiquette. But on my other Du Bois quote, the nation's appetite, this is written in 1912, the nation's appetite for facts on the Negro question has been spoiled by sweets. The nation's appetite for facts on the Negro question has been spoiled by sweets. There's been no point in the last 150 years or so when white America wasn't willing to call the race problem resolved. But and still, there's been, we're in an interesting historical moment now because there's been the determination of white Americans that the social order is just, and that the problem here is, Black culture or Black families, or is ahistorical, and it's also it's a defense of the existing social order, and though not phrase, not always self-understood that way, but it's you know, and it relies upon ignorance. There's a reason why our racial history makes such a sparse showing in the textbooks we give our children, because it serves that purpose of justifying the existing social order. But, and of course, this is particularly problematic, with respect to lynching, because that's one of the, it's a dramatic enactment of the architecture of social power. It's an announcement from and about the architecture of social power, and it's both so ugly that most white Americans can't bear to look at it, and it's also there's a stake in the outcome, because it inherently to assimilate that knowledge, to fully understand the day-to-day realities of the Jim Crow South with respect to violence, is to challenge the legitimacy of the current social order, which grew from it. So there's always a lot at stake in history, and there's a reason why we proceed the way we do. I got you one more quote. This is from Richard Wright, Black Boy, his autobiography. Richard Wright, who grew up in Mississippi, moved to Chicago. So he's writing about his boyhood in Mississippi in the 1920s. The things that influenced my conduct as a Negro did not have to happen to me directly. I needed but to hear about them to feel their full effects in the deepest layers of my consciousness. Indeed, the white brutality that I had not seen was a more effective control of my behavior than that which I knew. And that's a testimony and an explanation for white violence. There in the Banks case, as with Emmett Till, actually, there's this dispute about whether or not this is a lynching as opposed to a murder. If now, and of course, everything else is a lynching too, is something that drives me crazy. If Bill Cosby's treatment in court is a lynching, anyway, any number of white politicians have declared themselves lynching victims when many people object to what they have said or done. But if we are going to use lynching to describe someone not getting their position on the Supreme Court that they wanted, then we just have to come up with another word for actual lynching, because like genocide, lynching is a very important category of human activity, and we must understand it for what it is. And it's not a metaphor for anything. Like rape, for example, if you're going to say, people are always using the word rape to describe anything they consider to be an inappropriate political action or something unfair. When, if you're going to use that as a metaphor, then we're going to have to invent another word for the actuality. And so I don't use the word carelessly, but I do think it can feather out a little bit. Most people think it's not a lynching unless you have a rope. That's really quite common. And the discussion of the Till case, for instance, the white governor of Mississippi just ranted about how this was not a lynching. It was just a plain old murder. But one, lynching until meets all of the criterion of the formal definition of lynching, but two, though it was done, the spectacle lynchings of the first part of the 20th century, when you see the news of the lynching come in the newspaper before it happens, and thousands gather or hundreds gather, and people bring their families and have a picnic day of it, and it's a loud announcement. But even things that people claim are just murder are done with the knowledge that there'll be no punishment for the killers, and also it becomes a lynching after the fact, even if it doesn't quite fit all those criteria, because what it does is it is, as Richard Wright pointed out, it breeds fear in the minds of Black Southerners, and so it's a form of social control. And murders that don't quite fit the formal definition of lynching can be used as a lynching after the fact. If the word, even in Emmett Till's case, when he sunk the body in the river, they knew that word would get out. They knew that Black folks, this would be a matter of whisper, and that it would live in the memory of their African American fellow citizens. In Wilmington race riots, which is a whole nother kettle of violence, but the overthrow of the government, the state of North Carolina in 1898 and 1900, and the mass murder in the streets of Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. It was similarly an announcement from and about power. So these things, there's some continuity between forms of violence. The so-called race riots which nobody met, by the way, that wasn't a term of masking what happened. That's just what people in the early 20th century, late 19th century, when they said race riot, people knew that a white mob invaded the Black community, killing lots of people at random, destroying homes and businesses. And that was so race riot was commonly, it's just that now people could think about race riot as sort of angry African Americans destroying white-owned business property in a downtown somewhere in response to something that they find so objectionable that there's rage, and then there's also sort of logic to it. In that there's a sensibility that we won't get justice unless we get, this is sort of necessary to get white people's attention. But anyway, that's what we think of when we say race riot, but that's not what, when you hear race riot, Chicago riot of 1919 or whatever, East St. Louis riot of 1917. This is white mobs invading the Black community and killing a lot of people. Actually, it's what scholars call this genocidal massacre. As I just said, I'm queasy about people using the term genocide, but genocidal massacre is not genocide. What it is killing a lot of a certain group of people in order to control other members of those communities. Again, like lynching, it's a message from and about power. I wanted to, excuse me. I wanted to tell you a story that is in an oral history collection that was published back in the 70s. But, the interview takes place in that this is based on took place in the 1920s, I believe, but firmly in the Jim Crow era, and with someone who was formerly enslaved. So this is the story of Charlie Holcomb, who was born in 1890 in a pine board shack in Sampson County, North Carolina. By the way, anything in here that sounds like a quote is a quote. But anyway, Charlie Holcomb's father was a tenant farmer, and he roused the children from bed every day, and they had breakfast in the dark of grits and fried fatback. And then they went to the tobacco fields at sunup and worked till sundown. Charlie's grandfather was too old to work in the field, but he slopped hogs and fed the chickens. And sometimes he took young Charlie fishing, and he told Charlie stories that were designed to impart practical lessons about the world around them. Yeah, this is less than 50 years after emancipation, when Charlie was a boy. And the high hopes of Reconstruction and the fusion movement have been dashed by mass, unrestrained white violence and electoral fraud, the indifference, the utter indifference of folks up north and the federal government. And several times a week, Black Southerner was burned at the stake or hanged by a mob, tortured to death in the public square. Many others just disappeared. So it was important to teach children about the perils of white people. And Charlie Holcomb remembered one story of his grandfather's particularly clearly. They were fishing, and Charlie's grandfather pulled a catfish out of the river and put it on the bank, and the catfish writhed in agony. And then his grandfather lowered the line again and let the catfish swim for a moment, but not for long. He dragged the catfish back out of the water and let the fish thrash till it died on the bank, and told Charlie, "Son, catfish is a lot like an N-word. As long as he's in his mud hole, he is all right. But when he gets out of it, he is in for a whole passel of trouble. You remember that, and you won't have no trouble with folks when you grow up." Neither his grandfather nor his father owned any land, but Charlie was a talented farmer, and he aspired higher than most. He worked hard, he saved money, married, settled down, and tried to buy a farm, his dream. He said, year after year, there was always something come along and knock the props from under my plans. So he never made much money, but he farmed well. And one year he made a great crop at a time when prices were high. And he got enough money to buy the farm that he had always wanted. But his landlord called him back and said it'd been a mistake, and that and he took in the calculations, and he took back virtually all of those profits. Charlie knew he'd been cheated, but he also knew that he had no recourse to law. He recalled, "I knowed it wasn't right, and it made me so mad I just hit him in the face as hard as I could." The judge gave Charlie a year at hard labor, which is a lenient sentence for hitting a white man. And it almost amounts to an acceptance by the judge that Charlie was in the right, or his landlord was in the wrong at any rate. His family, his wife and children nearly starved in his absence. He got back out of prison in after that year, and he paid the landlord back because the judge had sort of because of the economic difficulty imposed by losing his sharecropper for a year, he had to pay restitution to the landlord who had already cheated him. Charlie said it had broken his spirit. By the time I knowed it, wasn't no use for me to ever try to make anything but just a living. So he made his peace with white supremacy, but he hoped for better things for his children, especially for his oldest and brightest child, Willie. Willie wanted to go to college, and his parents scraped and sacrificed and saved, and he went off to North Carolina A&T and studied farming. And he would work with his, come home and work with his father on the farm in the summers. He hauled the crops and he would add up the accounts, and he would sell the crop and bring the money home. But late one summer, he came home angry, saying that the man at the tobacco warehouse had tried to cheat them, that he had pulled out a pencil and done the calculations and stopped the sale. So the next day, Willie went down to the tobacco warehouse again, but at supper time, he was not home. Charlie Holcomb hitched up the mule and went into town, and he saw a crowd of white men standing around, and near them, his son lay on the ground, bleeding from his head. Charlie said, "I knowed he was dead the minute I saw him." He was brokenhearted. He gathered Willie's body, took it home and cleaned it for burial, and they buried it at the foot of a tall pine tree out back of their house. Charlie said he was never really the same again, that any aspiration that he had never breathed in him again. But he would sit under the lonesome pine tree and hear the wind whistling through the needles, and he would ponder both his own family's grief and the fate of his people. He blamed himself. He said, "I got to thinking about what Grandpappy said about the catfish, and I know that was the trouble with Willie. He had stepped out of his place. We went and got that education. If I'd kept him on the farm, he'd have been all right." None of the other Holcomb children got much in the way of education, and they settled down and were sharecroppers. Charlie kept his grandfather's lessons and his own tragedies close to his heart. Later, as he told the Works Progress Administration interviewer, "Inwards is built for service like a mule, and they needn't expect anything else. Inwards place is the field and the road and the tunnel and the woods with a pick or a shovel or an axe or a plow. God made the inward like a mule to be close to nature and get his living by the sweat of his brow, like the good book says." As he grew old, utterly resigned to his place in the world, Charlie Holcomb would sit by the fire and let his mind wander back to sweeter times, back to his childhood, which grew sweeter with the passage of time. And he remembered, seems like when a fellow looks back, he only remembers the good things. Like I remember how my grandpappy used to take me fishing. You know, most of the elements of white supremacy in the Jim Crow South are in this story: the economic exploitation of the crop lien system, sharecropping, tenant farming, the violence inherent in the social order, the stunted and confined lives that most Black Southerners had to live with, and that internalized white supremacy that was hammered into their heads by everything around them. If you can get people to believe that they're God ordained, that their place is they're God ordained, that it is somehow in the natural order of things, that they are subjugated, then you don't have to kill them quite so often. Violence, in fact, is diagnostic. Violence means we couldn't control it some other way. Usually, if you want to see what's going on, what you can get killed for is one thing to look at. Another thing is to look at the segregation laws, which if segregation laws differed from place to place, banned black and white people from playing checkers together, banned black and white people from going fishing together, banned the watching of prize fights with black and white people watching a prize fight. This was the, and of course, in many ways, segregation, the Jim Crow segregation was a school. It was to teach black and white Southerners their place in the social order. So people, my students just want to sort of, they all understand that somehow this was about water fountains and buses. But water fountains and buses were a way of instruction. You put a sign up, and black children at an early age learned or were intended to learn their subordinate place in the social order. The Jim Crow laws are interesting, and you should look them up because you can see they show the shape of the social order, and they show what was the problem. If there's a law against, there's no law in Durham that I know of keeping one's goats in the front yard, but that's because there's nobody doing that, right? If you have to outlaw white men and black men sitting downtown playing checkers together, it must be a common practice. It must, and it undermines the social order. Why were black and white people, why was it banned that they go fishing together? People were doing it. Segregation never worked as well.
Did you hit the mute button on us?
I didn't hit it that I know of. How long has that been on?
It was just very briefly, maybe 30 seconds.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't that long.
Missing a few of my precious words. I have more, so they won't hurt you. It's important to note that Black Southerners did not accept their subordinate position, which was, as soon as the Jim Crow social order is born, and it's important to note, I was raised to know that there was slavery and that was bad, and this is sort of, I learned this at school, and then that was followed by segregation, which was, man, I'd have been, was better than slavery, okay? And then that was followed by, full citizenship that we were coming into. But that's not the story at all. You had enslavement, then you had full citizenship for a time. Then you had struggle over that, and you had the violent overthrow of any such thing. And then when that was firmly established and you get Jim Crow segregation, that's when that comes up. It's really a product of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in most of its expression. And the segregation laws, that the earliest ones, were actually modeled on laws in the North. But underneath it all was violence. There was a rhetoric of paternalism. My grandmother told me at least a dozen times that our slaves loved us so much that when General Sherman's army came marching through, that they hid the family silver so that the Yankees couldn't take it. And, this, when I got old enough to do a little research, I discovered no slaves no silver for sure. And General Sherman's army, the closest they came to the family home place was 125 miles, which in the day of horse and buggy is a long way. You know, there was no, so that was, I know she thought that story was true, but, you know, like family stories, most family stories, you know, it may not be true, but it's got a purpose, you know, and that was her way of, I think she was really trying to say was that the assumption underneath it, of course, is that we are appropriately in a superior position. But the heart of the message is, now we're not trashy people who are mean to colored people. You're not, you know, we have this paternal, this personal connection to our colored people. So, you know, she did that. It was just trying, like most family stories are a way of saying, this is who we are. Right? This is what it's like to be a Freeman or a Henson or a Pearson. Is that's what the meaning of it is. So family stories are sort of giving you the meaning of what it means to be one of us. And white stories feature this paternalism, even from the most rabid, murderous segregationists have stories of, you know, the gratitude with which they are, which their actions are felt by their African American neighbors and employees, which is a way of it's a self-congratulation. It's smoothing off the rough edges of the heart of violence underneath the social system, and smoothing that off and covering it with a patina of friendship. You know, when I wrote Blood Doesn't Sign My Name, which was kind of part history and part memoir about the murder in Oxford and the way that spoke to the whole history of race in America, and particularly in the South. But when that book was published, a lot of people, you know, came to book signings and they would stand in line for me to scribble in their book. And, you know, I perceived that the way people felt often was that I'd been telling them a story and that they wanted to tell me a story. And I would estimate about 25% of the people who were standing there and wanted to tell me the same story, which is, what they heard me say was, don't be mean to Black people, which is not at all what I said. But what they wanted me to know was that they, like me, were on the side of the angels, which is not what I had said either. And they wanted to tell me why. And why was, you know, Louise, who worked in our house, and their relationship with Louise. And she was, in the same three words, just like family. And I'm just kind of allergic to that story. And especially after a couple of weeks of this. And I started asking a few questions sometimes. The first one was, oh, so she had health insurance, I guess. They would look confused, and I would say, well, you know, if she didn't have health insurance and she came, you know, got leukemia or something, well, you'd have to sell your house to pay her hospital bill, wouldn't you? Was she in the will? Often they don't know her last name. They don't know how many children she had or where she is now. But their relationship with this mammy figure, this paternalistic relationship of being good to these, you know, being good to Black folks, it is a kind of a mark of good character. If you read the autobiographies or biographies written of great white men in the South by a ghostwriter, generally speaking, they have a biography of themselves written because of their obvious importance. It's usually not a scholarly endeavor, but those books always have an episode about the relationship the paternalistic relationship of that person to Black people, even if it's Ben Tillman, who's like the most murderous white supremacist demagogue. It's a tough, competition, but you could argue he was the most murderous and nastiest white racist demagogue in the history of the South, and he built a little monument to his valet, which was really a monument, of course, to his own generosity. So for white people, those things, Black people's service to them, and this false relationship between them, which relationships are complicated. Just because there's love doesn't mean there's not. If there's love, that doesn't mean there's honesty. If there's love, this doesn't mean that it's unqualified. You can, if there's an attachment, it doesn't mean there's an acceptance of this social order. And, it doesn't mean if there's a pretense to personal connection, that doesn't mean there is a personal connection. So, so for what supplied white folks with cheap labor and many conveniences, that stuff was not nearly as luxurious as the feeling of they were doing right and good, Christians and kind people in this paternalist thing. That's a great luxury. And for African Americans in that social relationship, it was dribs and drabs of clothing and food and things to share with their children. It was having white folks who could vouch for them if somebody got in trouble, or it was like scraps. But anyway, paternalism, I think, is probably the most poisonous and common form of white supremacy that was part of the world in which I've grown up. But there's no paternalism without violence. It doesn't. Violence is the undergirding. Paternalism is like the green ivy, that's on top of the stone wall. It's not the essence of the wall. It's just a cover for the wall. As for violence, Glenda Gilmore, historian from North Carolina, who's one of the great Southern historians, she writes, murder does its best work in memory. And the memory of violence exerts fear and control on folks even to this day. So that's some historical musings about the social order in which the lynching of Isidore Banks takes place. And we can perhaps talk some more about Isidore Banks, whom I've been learning a lot about in the last 2 days.
Thank you. I can't express enough how grateful I am to hear and to be here with you, acknowledging that there's so much to unpack in this Isidore Banks series, which is why we've been focused on it since December. And here we are in March, and the conversations keep evolving and developing. And so I just want to give some context a little bit. I didn't open with context because I wanted to let folks just hear you speak. And just noting, like, I think in the last few sessions, we've heard from Miss Wilma Liverpool, we've heard from Andre Van, we've heard from the director and producer of the series. And at this point, just acknowledging how much of the faith community is involved in this work. And that's because it's a responsibility we carry. I know that I want to make sure that I circle back. I did note in the chat to Miss Liverpool, and just I'm trying to find her. I try to make her a co-host so I could keep an eye on her. I saw you. There you go, Miss Liverpool.
I wanted to thank the speaker for what he brought out, which is truth. But I also wanted to talk about when he said about the black beast rapist. And I get a lot of pushback when I remind people that it's the white, Christian, God-fearing, the judges, the US presidents, the preachers who were the pedophiles that were raping young children, and they were the slave owners and the sellers of people and the murderers. And people don't like to hear that. And my thing is, well, just go look it up because it's true. And I wanted to ask the speaker if he considers lack of owed reparations as financial lynching, which is what I consider it, and why has the collective church, not just the Episcopalians, but the church as a collective body, why do they still continue to publicly ignore these facts? And this is why I can't go sit and listen to a minister telling me, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, but you will not bring this up about what has happened in the past and is happening presently. So I would like for him to answer that if he could or if he would.
You've opened up so many things that I want to mention, but let me go straight to the church for a minute. The evangelical, Christian evangelical, the white evangelical church has become an arm of the conservative movement, and it has turned Jesus into someone who is opposed to abortion and in favor of gun rights, and wants to define morality as primarily centered on abortion and homosexuality. And as near as I can figure, they just flee from the personality of Jesus, the works of Jesus, the philosophy of Jesus. They just flee from it as fast as they can run, because it's hard to make Jesus a rabid capitalist, gun rights figure, and the they say so much about what my friend Reverend Dr. William Barber, they say so much about things that the Bible says so little about, and so little about what the Bible says so much about, which relates to your question about reparations, because economics, the welfare of human beings, their ability to cultivate their God-given gifts, their capacities as full human beings, the self-respect, equality before a loving God, mercy as a principal value, and his dismissal really of the accumulation of wealth as a great thing. Those things don't fit into the political program, and I believe that's a huge chunk of the church that's given way to a political program. White supremacy I think it's very important to note, white supremacy is a broad term, but it's essentially the belief that God has created humanity in a hierarchy of moral, cultural, and intellectual worth based on pigmentation, with the lightest folks on the top and the darkest folks at the bottom. That's the notion of white supremacy. That's the central lie of white supremacy. But white supremacy is also is the unconscious assumptions that people have reflecting those values in their heads, semi-consciously or unconsciously even. It is also a political project. And, as my friend Steve Kantrowitz says, he's a historian at Wisconsin, he writes, white supremacy was hard work. They were always having to nail it back into place, and it was constantly, that is to say, the political project, which is ongoing. And if you're part of the political project of white supremacy, as much of the white church is, then, you got your fingers, not only, or you have your fingers in your ears when reparations comes up, but you have your fingers in your ears when Jesus comes up in any meaningful way. So the reparations involves, there's an admission of guilt, or if not guilt, there's an admission of the benefit that you receive from being white in a white dominated country, right? So regardless of your personal, even if you can't find the racist bone in your body that nobody seems to be able to locate, you nonetheless are undeniably the beneficiaries of a system of racial supremacy and of that definition of white supremacy, and which religion has been wrapped all around the whole way. But so Ta-Nehisi Coates makes a point that he says there's no white racial politics that is not the politics of self-exoneration. So conservatives tend to argue that they didn't have any slaves. Their people weren't even in this country at that time. It's been a long time, and this history is irrelevant now. Not that history is no longer relevant. Essentially, the thing is, it's not my fault, and I'm not going to do anything about it. I will not be held responsible for something that is not my fault. In other words, I'm pure of heart as far as this issue goes. So often white liberals, their point is, our family was never like that, and my parents taught me never to say that, and I'm fully in support of Black freedom movement, and I know all the right words. I've caught up on the lingo, so I can drop white fragility or whatever the latest. We can all go back in time and put. A lot of, I think, white liberals feel like if we all just learn to say the right words, that would fix it, if we were all culturally competent. But anyway, so in other words, often white liberals talking about their relationship to race is actually also self-exoneration, because beneath it all is that, I'm pure of heart. Oh my goodness. And so I'm not responsible. I'm on the side of the angel. So they end you up in the same place, which is, it's not my fault. And guilt is one thing that people are running from. I just try to tell people, look, it would be sick if you blame yourself for the Atlantic slave trade. You had nothing to do with it, right? So, a lot of times well-meaning white people, they feel guilty and they think they've done something. They come to a program maybe like this and they leave smelling like a rose because they felt bad about it. And then they think they've done something. And, you know, we can't wait till the saints come marching in to do something about our social system. And it's going to require white people who want their children and grandchildren to grow up in a multiracial, vibrant democracy to stand up for those values, to find their own stake in a system that is just, in a system that is merciful, in a system devoted to the respect for humanity and equality and justice. And they're going to have to summon the political will to do something. I don't care so much about my heart is a nest of snakes. My goodness. That's why I say white supremacy more often than not, because that is it's a system of racial supremacy, because people want to confuse racism with like ethnic resentment. And it's like, black people can be racist too. It's like, well, last time I checked, black people weren't running a system of supremacy, right? There's not an ideology of, with minor exceptions.
There's no first white president situation. It's all the presidents.
Oh, yes.
And one that's not.
Right. And and if you, everything, I talk about race and history and often racial violence a fair amount and teach about it. I was once teaching a class, and this is a sort of illustration of the point. I was once teaching a class, and it was day 2, the first real lecture. I brushed a little at the beginning, the introductory sort of to the class and how it works. But then the first real lecture was on the Atlantic slave trade. And, it's a huge death machine that, to understand, if you understand, you find yourself at the bottom of the Atlantic with the bones of millions of dead Africans. And you gotta look that in the eye, and listen to those bones. That has to be, this starts. And that was, of course, rationalized in terms of religion. White people were elevating the people they were enslaving, giving them access to the gospel and so on. So that, and which that kind of broke down actually when African Americans started converting to Christianity. Does that mean they're free? Turns out not so much. But and that's where white supremacy as an ideology is born, really, as a rationalization. If you're going to run an enormous death machine that's responsible for much of the wealth on earth, then you have to have a rationale. And white supremacy is first it was Christianity, and that gave way to more explicitly a white supremacist ideology, which is where that crazy notion comes from. Anyway, getting back to reparations, they don't want to look the history in the eye, and you have to do that to understand reparations, the very idea of reparations. I got off of it. So here I am giving that lecture on the Atlantic slave trade, and then I see this white kid. He's halfway up this 250 seat auditorium. He's about halfway up. He's got his baseball cap on backwards, which is sort of the frat boy mark, one of the frat boy uniforms where I was at University of Wisconsin. And his face is contorting quite a bit while I'm lecturing. And I can't really figure out whether it's, it's about as hard as history gets, It's so I wasn't alarmed about it. But then before I was really, ready to take questions, up goes his hand. He just can't bear it anymore. So I interrupted myself and called on him. And he said, yeah, this is terrible, but, affirmative action. He wanted to talk about affirmative action when we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade. So, people hear their own history as an indictment of them. right? And they want you to know, like, they're not at fault and they're not going to. And, you know, I had to just say, well, you know, affirmative action is, you know, pretty much a, you know, 1970s kind of notion. And, you know, we can talk about it when we get there. But right now, you know, we're in, you know, in the 18th and 19th century when the slave trade was like the oil of the 17th and 18th century, 19th to some degree. But anyway, that's a familiar pattern, you know. There's just a lot at stake with the reparations piece. But, you know, one thing that I try to ask people when they want to talk with me about it, you know, I'm talking about white folks really, is, well, what should we do about the racial chasm in American life? What should we do about the yawning gap in economics and opportunity and education and housing and criminal justice? And what should we do about it? You know, and of course, they ain't gonna do nothing about it. They have no proposal, right? It's just that reparations is, you know, totally unacceptable. But
I just want to note that the yesterday, I think in the news, there was the articles around Evanston, Illinois, being the first city to pass reparations on a municipal level. And I want to make sure that I state here, and as often as possible, that is not reparations. It is a program designed for people who pay taxes to offer those tax dollars to folks in the community. I do not think that they limited specifically, and I think there were a number of issues that were raised in the conversation. And I do want to thank Dr. Darity and Kirsten Mullen for attending and sharing the insights around what actual reparations would look like and how they should actually be applied from the federal government, who is responsible for actually implementing reparations. And then just noting that there were a lot of there's been a lot of media around the conversation because of the word. And I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of that exactly why I think these conversations build on why we're having this conversation and why reparations are owed. I do note that there were a couple of questions, and Cameron was going to ask one. And I know that Gail Goldsmith, I just wanted to check in and make sure that you didn't have to leave at 1 o'clock and you weren't going to, if you were okay. And Dr. Tyson, we're fine. Continue to elaborate as much as you possibly can, as much as you want. We are open. I can stay here till 2 p.m. if I need to. This is a conversation. It's a great conversation.
Okay, Congresswoman, City Council, I'm speaking prophetically, City Council Woman Freeman. I don't know if some of us could stay that long, but I'm appreciative of this. Yes.
Let's just go the whole hog.
Exactly. I did want to, were you going to say something, Dr. Tyson?
No, I was just saying that President Freeman has my vote, that's all.
She has a lot of our votes, but I wanted to bring up one comment that Esther Coleman put in the chat, just in case folks really look at the chat, because people are starting to tell their own stories. And I think oftentimes it's not just the story of the larger context, it's also our individual stories, because we are, as descendants of formerly enslaved African peoples and also indigenous people who are descendants of people that have been displaced, and the intentional attempt at the total eradication of First Nation people groups is all wound up in this story and the justification theologically by white supremacist, what I say, het cis normative, theological based ideology of how people see God or Jesus and how they dehumanize others and they legitimize that is all wrapped up in what Dr. Tyson is talking about. And so Esther was saying quite the opposite of Tim's story about his grandmother. My daughter and I were able to verify the lynching of our cousin in South Georgia in the 1930s, which was a story I heard over from my mother growing up when we visited the Equal Justice Initiative Memorial, which is down in Montgomery. I highly suggest, if you're able to take a trip down there, that you do so. It was all true. Even made it to the US Supreme Court, where the sheriff who killed him was let go. I just want to honor him today. His name was Robert Hall, and he was only about 30 years old. And so this is the story. All of these things happen to our people. They happened to my family, Mother Liverpool's family, Deidreana's family, you know, Brother Keith's family. There are Black, and the people that did it were representative of the white, like Kathy's family, Dr. Tyson. I mean, these were white families that did this to our people. So we have a reckoning that we have to kind of come and put together the pieces, because who we say we are and who we actually are is not actually, it's not coalescing at all. And then we have a question from Whit Trumbull, which is, which formerly Confederate states had interracial governments that were opposed and undermined by white supremacists, and where can they find out more information about this? Okay, Dr. Tyson, you got the floor.
It'd be Tennessee and Virginia and North Carolina. There's if you Google Ghosts of 1898, there's what was a 16-page newspaper insert in the News and Observer back in 2006 that I wrote. It's a good brief account of the crushing of the fusion movement and a little about the fusion movement. Complete. Last name Umfleet. I'm blanking on her name. Maybe Glenn there can help me. I'm forgetting her. I know her. She's a friend of mine. Anyway, Umfleet, Day of Blood is it's a study of the Wilmington race riot, but it goes into the fusion movement. Timothy B. Tyson at gmail.com. Timothy B. Tyson, gmail.com. I'll go over and look at my I used to know authors, titles, page numbers, but my mind is deteriorating. But I'll go look at my shelf and give you a fuller historiography. In the back of that Ghost of 1898, there's a list of sources that includes some stuff that would interest you, but there's been a lot of stuff written here lately too. So,
just to let you know, I did include it in the chat so that folks can actually go to that.
Oh, also about the interracial political coalitions, a good place to look is Jane Dailey, Dailey, whatever it is. What's the name of that book? Hey,
I know the next question will come from Gail Goldsmith. I know you've had your hand raised for a while.
I cannot remember. It's the only book she's written so far. Jane Dailey, Dailey. I'm forgetting the title, but it's about the readjuster movement in Virginia, which is takes power in the 1880s and is in power for about 3 years. The interracial government here in North Carolina began to take power in 1894. They started winning legislative seats. In 1896, they swept the legislature and took control of it electorally, and also elected both U.S. senators and the governor. So they were fusionists, the fusion movement, they called it. And they were overthrown by violence. They were never beaten at the polls, could not be beaten at the polls. But the violence and widespread electoral fraud and essentially a coup against the state government.
Oh, you mean voter suppression today?
Oh, and this is where disfranchisement came from. And North Carolina was a prime example. In 1898 and in 1900, they had what was called the white supremacy campaigns. And one of the principal ends of which was constitutional amendment that took away the rights of African Americans to vote. Although significantly, it never said the word race or African Americans, or it involved literacy tests for voting. And then there was the grandfather clause, which said if your grandfather could vote, you didn't have to take the literacy test. And of course, the literacy test was given by white registrars who weren't, nobody passed, Black people did not pass the literacy test. A few freakish examples, but on the whole, Black turnout was very high in the late 19th century in North Carolina, upper 80%, 89, 88, something like that. And, was down to an infinitesimal percentage, 2%, 1%, very after the overthrow of the state government in 1900. And that's when the Jim Crow structure is built. And this is the same in Tennessee's interracial government was also overthrown by violence. And then in the 9 states of the Confederacy where there were interracial political movements, the massive violence against the movements prevented them from having a shot at taking. I'm not saying that all of them were strong enough to take state power. I expect that none of them were, but their political power was crushed by violence. Alabama's just a bloodbath.
I think Gail Goldsmith, you had a question.
Actually, it was early on. I just wanted to make a statement about the play Anne and Emmett, and it's actually on YouTube, and so I put it in the chat. So it wasn't really a question, but that was way early on before we got really into the discussion. Thank you, Dr.
Sorry about that.
No.
Thank you for sharing. Cameron, you're on mute. And I'm just checking. I did get kicked out for a second. I had lost my connection. And so I lost some of the chat that happened beforehand. And I was just checking to make sure with Cameron and Kathy if there were any other additional questions that were in the chat.
Oh, one of our friends actually mentioned something that I want to just address quickly, which is rape and sexualized racial violence was an important part, like lynching, it was an important part of the social order of Jim Crow. And, there's a great new book about that. It's not actually that new. It's 2010, but At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power. It is one of the most important books in the history of the freedom movement, and shows how throughout the civil rights movement, and she goes back, that rape and sexual violence against Black women was a principal, obstacle and degradation, but also a motivation for the movement, which, she tells the story of Ms. Reese Taylor, who Oprah actually retold the story 2 years ago, I think, at the Golden Globes. There's a documentary film too, but Mrs. Reese Taylor, who was gang raped on a lonely road, kidnapped from her family after church, and taken out and gang raped. And then she was in Abbeville, and the NAACP in Alabama sent an investigator out to look into this story. And the investigator's name was Rosa Parks. This is 1944. And she helped to organize the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Reese Taylor in 1944, which becomes national in its scope. And there's a series of cases. There's the Committee to Defend Gertrude Perkins. There's, and you go on and on. There's, I think there were about 9 different campaigns. And I was sitting with her in the Birmingham Public Library, and she opened a box, and there was a letterhead, and it said Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Reese Taylor. In those days, on a fundraising letter or organizing letter, you would put the names of of people who were part of the organizing in the left-hand margin, so that you could pick up the letter and just look at the names, and you might know, like, oh, Du Bois is involved, which, and then there were a lot of names, and And I looked and I thought, wait a minute, that's like half, at least half of the leadership of the Montgomery Improvement Association in 1944, right? So those women, over the course of those cases, grew more and more numerous and powerful, and they shut down a white man's grocery store and drove him out of business with a boycott. They were, so women in Montgomery were organizing around their, their physical integrity, about being treated with disrespect, all the way on over to these incessant sexual assaults. And that is a big piece of what was happening with the buses. And if you look at the pictures of the mass meetings in Montgomery, I've got a sharp pencil one day and just counted, and it was just, I don't know, I can't remember it, high 80% women. And it was very much on one level a women's movement, even though the leader, recognized leadership is male. And that's has its roots in this community organizing over a dozen years before. And but that doesn't get reported. We get Rosa Parks, a heroic single act of a brave individual who wasn't political. Her feet were tired, and she's portrayed as being sort of a sweet little old lady in that way, and she's her virtue and her being a good church woman, all this is highly relevant, in this narrative. When she was, might have been the most politically active Black person in Montgomery, if she wasn't, and her sidekick E.D. Nixon was, and they were really virtually the same person as far in political terms.
Thank you, Dr. Tyson. I would also just note in the chat, we had a request to circle back to the conversation or the comment around the church being complicit as they preach on, thou shalt not kill, and not addressing all the killing that has happened on behalf of the church.
There's a really excellent book that I would recommend, by H. Sheldon Smith, who was the founder of the North Carolina Council of Churches in 1935, which came out against segregation in 1935. The next white reformer group, Christian group that came out against segregation is, you're talking about late 1950s or early 1960s, 1935, that quite aside. So, but H. Sheldon Smith, and it's in his image, but ... and it's about white supremacy in the church, I think from 1815 to 1915, something like that. But what you had was the Methodists and I'm sure Episcopalians and the mainstream white churches, particularly Methodists and Quakers, but virtually all the white denominations came out against slavery, and then 10 minutes later, they realized how much money that was going to cost them. And because of the slave owners and how much economic clout they wielded within the church. So it's just like today, there's this, attempt at good intentions, and then that goes by the wayside in the name of what we now call church development. And so,
I think Cameron and I both were a part of a Christian community development group that spoke that face. Yes. It's interesting. The church planting conversations. Yes. Yeah.
And, Jesus is a terrible, terrible impediment to church development, it turns out.
Yes, he is. When you're telling the truth out of northern Africa, yes. There's so much there. I think we're coming up on about 1:30, and I just want to make sure that if we have other questions or statements folks want to leave us with, that I give you a chance to share that in the last few minutes. And of course, definitely please continue to use the chat. I think the chat's been going. I can't even keep up. It's just ping, ping, ping. But I appreciate the conversation. I really appreciate Dr. Tyson being here. And I know Cameron, before we close out, I'll direct it to you. Just checking. I don't see any hands raised.
Do we have
and
any
I did
other
allow
questions?
you to all say it again.
I just want to know if you had any questions or more comments, just iterating what you had mentioned earlier.
Yes, and then just noting, I did note that you can unmute yourself if you just want to blurt it out.
Yeah, to save on time. Yeah, of course.
Yes. All hearts and minds are clear.
Okay. Okay. Well, I just wanted to round it up by stating, that this is a very important part of the work that we do with the reason why Communities in Partnership, the ED, which is me, actually is a recovering pastor's wife. And my husband and I, in our journey and our Christian walk, was really sucked into the evangelical church for quite a few years and spent a huge amount of our time and effort, basically not only exposing our children to highly toxic and paternalistic systems and ways of thinking and ideology, and how we had to come out of that and decolonize our theological construct and regain and claim our humanity back. And so it's really important, this work, from my perspective, while we partner with EUAR, which is a truly anti-racism organization, and have a very clear ideology, and from a person who does believe in Jesus Christ, a very firm theological basis in who I am and my humanity being uplifted, and the humanity of all people, no matter their race, their creed, their sexual orientation, their ability, or their disability. There is no excuse to ever dehumanize or take away the civil liberties or oppress people. We are all created in the image of God. And so this work is very important to us. And we cannot begin to actually decolonize those tapes and those ways of being without actually looking at who we actually are. And so this has been a very important conversation that Kathy, Deidreana, and myself have been really wanting to have, is looking at, especially right now, as we're seeing a lot of the things that are going down, specifically in the more conservative faith communities, where Black and brown people are basically leaving in droves because of the dehumanization that is actually a byproduct of plantation theology, that white people were created in the image of God, and they actually deserve all of the power, all of the control, and all of the wealth. Mm-hmm. And so we just want to thank Dr. Tyson for, as a white man, or a man who comes from a people who have become to be known as white, because that's not who Dr. Tyson or any of our white brothers and sisters are. Yes. That's a part of the actual social construct that actually has been used to also dehumanize the folks that have become to be known as white. Our Jewish brothers and sisters, our Irish brothers and sisters, our Italian brothers and sisters, our British brothers and sisters. And so we really are grateful for a man who was brought up in the South, really dedicated education, his life, his faith, to decolonizing these constructs and telling the truth and holding it up for all of us to learn from, and to hold us accountable, to create an atmosphere of accountability. We really thank you, Dr. Tyson, for doing that today. So we just really appreciate you coming here. We hope we can hold a relationship with you so we can bring you back at another time, because we've really learned a lot in this day. Yes. And so for me, it's a breath of fresh air. And every time I hear you and Deidreana and Kathy, like, you really need to go to seminary. And I'm hearing you right now, and I'm like, yes, I do. I need to go to seminary. So.
Yes. Oh my God. I don't want to be any part of subjecting you to something.
So I just really thank you for putting that fire in
for a long time. My minister in peace. Oh my goodness.
But I can see that you're actually you've got it. You've got it. It's got you. Yes, I think you may as well give in. But there are a lot of different ways to do that.
Yep. And I might be following up with you personally on some advice for that. So yes, absolutely. I appreciate all of your work and all of the work towards liberation, to reclaim the humanity for our European descent brothers and sisters, as well as holding up the humanity of everyone else. So we really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dr. Tyson, for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. I've enjoyed it greatly.
And we enjoyed you. I do want to follow up and just note that we will continue the conversation. Just know we don't intend to ever try to unpack or do anything in just an hour or an hour and 30 minutes. We know very seriously that this work is something we are doing continuously. And so out of the Faith Summit, I do want to just track back and note that, we focus on our 4 points in our journey together in a kind of connected circle to connect, speak, act, and learn continuously. And so we are all at different spaces and stages in this conversation, and we'll continue to do the work. And we'll continue to pour into what others are doing in the community, and just being supportive of one another. And so I just want to just note that the next session, I think Kathy shared earlier, would be April the 14th.
Yes.
Second Wednesday. And we will actually continue this conversation with our small breakout groups, and that will not be recorded. So we won't have it available for folks on YouTube. If you want to join, you have to be here in the space. On the Zoom. I know that we are way over, but I felt like it was important to allow, the process to come to life. And so I do feel like, I've got a little tear in my eye over here trying to hold it back. That this is how I eat. And so I know someone noted in the chat they were filled with this. I am definitely full today, and I appreciate you. Kathy, did you want to say anything?
No, just thanks everyone for coming. And thank you, Dr. Tyson. It's just been an amazing and inspiring conversation today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you for modeling, helping us to model being white identified people who are striving to be anti-racist.
Yes, thank you.
Striving.